I have always been the kind of woman who trusts, not blindly, not without discernment, but genuinely and deeply and with the full weight of myself. I think this is a quality that served me well in most areas of my life, and that served me very poorly in the one area where it mattered most. I trusted my husband for 20 years in the way you trust someone you have built a life with, someone whose face you know better than your own in certain lights, someone whose habits and preferences and silences you have learned to read like a language that exists between the two of you and nowhere else. I trusted him completely, and then he handed me a document and asked me to sign it, and something in the way he asked made me not sign it. I cannot explain that instinct with any precision. It was not a thought, it was something beneath thought. A signal from some part of me that had been paying attention in ways my conscious mind had not caught up to. A small cold stillness that arrived when he slid the papers across the kitchen table and said it was simple, just a formality, nothing to worry about. Those 3 words, nothing to worry about. I have thought about them many times since. I have thought about the fact that in 20 years of marriage, my husband had never used those words to describe something that was actually nothing to worry about. When things were genuinely fine, he did not feel the need to say so. The reassurance arrived precisely when reassurance was functioning as a substitute for transparency. I am 54 years old. I was married to a man I will call Richard for 21 years. We met when I was 32 and he was 35, both of us at ages when you have already made enough mistakes to understand what you are choosing and why. We were not a romantic movie story. We were 2 adults who recognized in each other something compatible and substantial, and who decided, with the deliberateness that comes from being past the age of pure impulse, to build something together. We built a good deal, a home that we purchased jointly in the 3rd year of our marriage, and that had, over the following 18 years, appreciated significantly. 2 children, a son and a daughter, now in their late teens and early 20s, who are the best thing I have ever been part of. A life that looked from the outside and largely felt from the inside like a successful life. A partnership between 2 people who respected each other and shared responsibilities and moved through the world with a sense of shared direction. I worked throughout our marriage. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what follows. I have a career in marketing consulting, a business I built over 15 years that operates under my name and that has clients I have maintained through consistent work and genuine expertise. I am not someone who was financially dependent on Richard. I earned well. I managed my own professional finances carefully. I contributed to our household, to our mortgage, to our children's futures, with full and documented participation. Richard worked in commercial real estate. He was good at it for a long time, and then he was less good at it for reasons I understood only partially and that I now understand with a completeness I did not have before. He had been, in the last several years before the document appeared, navigating some professional difficulties, deals that had not closed the way he had anticipated, a partnership that had dissolved in ways he described vaguely and that I had not pressed him on because I trusted him and because his professional world had always felt somewhat opaque to me, and because I had my own work demanding my attention, and because, I now understand, he had been carefully managing what I knew. The document arrived on a Wednesday evening in November. I remember the month because the kitchen window was showing bare branches and a sky the color of pewter, and I remember thinking that it was the kind of evening that felt like a held breath, which I now understand was my body knowing something my mind had not caught up to. Richard came home later than usual. He was not unusual about it, not agitated or particularly rehearsed in demeanor. He poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table and set the papers on the surface between us with a matter-of-factness that was, I later understood, practiced. He said it was something for a refinancing arrangement on one of his commercial properties. He said the bank required both signatures because we filed jointly. He said it was standard and simple, and not something I needed to read in detail. He said that last part. Not something I needed to read in detail. I picked the papers up. There were 11 pages. I am not a lawyer. I do not have a legal background beyond the general literacy with contracts that a 20-year career in business consulting produces. But I am a careful reader. I am someone who reads things before signing them, not because I am suspicious by nature, but because I was taught that signing something you have not read is a form of carelessness that no relationship should require of you. I began to read. Richard watched me with the particular quality of attention of someone trying to appear unconcerned. He asked if I wanted tea. I said no. He got up and made some anyway and stood by the counter while I read. I noticed the standing. He usually sat. He was standing in the way people stand when they are managing the impulse to move, when stillness is effortful. I read for perhaps 20 minutes. The language was dense, as legal and financial language is. I understood portions of it clearly, and portions of it only approximately. But in approximately the middle of the document, I found something that I understood precisely, and that made me stop reading and look up. The document was not, or not only, a refinancing instrument. It contained language that appeared to me, reading it as carefully as I could, to function as a personal guarantee. Language that, if I signed, would attach my personal financial liability to obligations that were Richard's professionally, not our joint obligations, his. I looked at him. He said it was standard language. He said all spousal signatures on commercial documents contain this kind of clause. He said it was boilerplate and not meaningful in practice. I said I would like to have someone look at it before I signed. The quality of stillness in the room changed, not dramatically. Richard did not raise his voice or change his expression in any obvious way, but something shifted in the atmosphere, the way the air shifts before weather, and I felt it on my skin before I could name it. He said there was a deadline. He said the bank had given a window and it was closing. He said a few days was fine, but not longer. I said I understood, and I folded the document and put it in my bag. That night, after Richard had gone to sleep, I sat at the desk in my home office with the 11 pages in front of me, and I read them again. Slowly, twice, with a dictionary open on my laptop for the terms I did not know. And the second reading confirmed what the first had suggested and deepened it in ways that the first had not fully revealed. This was not a simple refinancing document. This was, as far as I could understand it, an instrument that would make me personally liable for significant commercial debt. Debt that was Richard's. Debt that I had known nothing about in its specific dimensions until I was holding a document and being asked to assume responsibility for it on a Wednesday evening without being told that was what I was doing. I did not sleep well. The next morning, after Richard left for work, I made a phone call. I had a friend, a woman I had known for 14 years, through professional circles, who had been through a divorce 3 years earlier, and who had, in the aftermath of that experience, mentioned the name of a family law attorney with the particular emphasis of someone who means for you to remember it in case you ever need it. I had never expected to need it. I had held the name anyway, the way you hold certain information without knowing why, in the back of the mental filing system, where things go that you hope never to retrieve. I retrieved it. I called my friend first. I told her I needed a referral. She heard something in my voice and did not ask questions. She gave me the name and number again and said to call that morning and to use her name. I called. The attorney's name was Patricia. She had an opening that afternoon due to a cancellation. I took it. I want to tell you about that first meeting because it was the most clarifying 2 hours of the preceding decade. Patricia was in her mid-50s, precise without being cold, the kind of person whose intelligence presented itself as attention rather than performance. She took the document I handed her, and she read it in a way that was different from how I had read it, with the efficiency of someone who has read 10,000 documents of this kind and knows within the first paragraph what she is looking at. She read without expression for about 12 minutes. Then she looked up. She asked me several questions: how long we had been married, whether I had signed anything similar in the past, whether I was aware of the specific commercial properties Richard held and their associated debt structures, whether I had visibility into our joint financial picture in detail or in general terms. I answered honestly. I had general visibility. I had trusted Richard with the specifics of his professional finances because that had been the arrangement throughout our marriage. He managed his business affairs and I managed mine, and we met at the level of household finances and joint decisions. I had not known the details because I had not asked for them, because I had not imagined I needed to. Patricia made notes, then she said something that I will not reproduce verbatim, because I want to be careful about putting precise words in the mouth of a real professional. But the substance was this. She said the document I had been given to sign was not standard. She said the liability it would attach to me was not boilerplate. She said the scale of the obligation it represented, based on what she could read in the document and the figures it referenced, was significant. And she said that before I signed anything, she needed to understand the full picture of Richard's professional financial situation, because the document she was holding suggested that picture might be considerably different from what I had been led to believe. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her what I needed to do. She told me, and I did exactly what she said. The first thing she requested was that I obtain, without alerting Richard, as much documentation as I could, access legitimately. Our joint tax returns for the preceding 5 years, which I was entitled to and which I had copies of. Our joint account statements, which I was entitled to and which I could access online. Any property documents in both our names, which I had access to through our home files. She was specific about what was jointly mine to access and what was not, and she was clear that I should not reach beyond that boundary. I spent the weekend gathering what she had asked for. Richard was home. I was normal. I made dinner on Saturday, and we watched something together on television in the evening, and I was present and warm and gave nothing away. I had not fully understood until that weekend that I was capable of this kind of containment. It did not feel like deception. It felt like self-preservation, which I had discovered in the preceding 72 hours was something I was going to need to become skilled at, quickly. Patricia reviewed everything the following week. She called me on a Thursday and asked me to come in. What she told me in that second meeting reorganized my understanding of my own marriage in ways I am still, more than a year later, continuing to process. Richard's commercial real estate business was in serious trouble, not recent trouble. Trouble that had been accumulating for at least 4 years, possibly longer, managed and restructured and partially concealed through a series of financial maneuvers that I had not known about and had not been told about. The document he had asked me to sign was connected to a refinancing arrangement that was itself connected to a debt structure that was, in Patricia's assessment, precarious in ways that made my signature on a personal guarantee a significant and immediate risk to my personal financial standing. He had known this. He had known it for years. He had managed the household finances in ways that insulated me from the details. He had presented his professional situation to me in terms that were technically not false, but that were incomplete in ways that had the same practical effect as falsehood. And he had waited until the situation had become urgent enough to require my signature, and then he had brought a document to the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and told me it was simple and nothing to worry about. I sat in Patricia's office and I looked at a picture of my marriage that was different from the picture I had been living in. Not completely different, not a total revision. There was a version of the preceding 4 years in which Richard had been frightened and managing an escalating crisis and trying to protect me from the anxiety of knowing. I considered that version. I held it alongside the other version, in which he had been protecting himself from the consequences of disclosure by managing my information carefully. And I could not determine with certainty which version was more true. What I could determine was that in either version I had been kept outside the full reality of my own marriage's finances for a significant period. That the document on the kitchen table had been an attempt, whether desperate or calculating, to use my signature to take on an obligation I had not consented to. That I had 3 days ago almost signed something that would have altered my financial standing fundamentally, and that I would not have fully understood until the consequences arrived. The 3 days between the kitchen table and Patricia's office were the 3 days that changed everything. I told Patricia to proceed with whatever she needed to do. She advised me to think carefully about whether I was considering divorce or whether I was considering a renegotiation of our financial arrangements within the marriage. She said those were different paths. She said I did not need to decide that day. I went home. Richard was there. He asked if I had had a chance to look at the document. I said I had been reviewing it. He said the deadline was in 2 days. I said I was working through it. That evening I asked him, calmly and directly, to sit down with me and explain the full scope of his business situation. Not the version he had been offering, the real version. He was quiet for a moment. Then he began to talk. It took 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years, which told me something about the preceding years that I found difficult to sit with. He told me about the debt, the restructurings, the deals that had failed, the partnerships that had dissolved in ways more complicated than he had let on, the specific obligations he was now facing. He told me he had been trying to manage it without burdening me. He told me he had thought the document was a solution that would buy him time. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him whether, if I had signed the document without reading it, he would have told me what I had signed. He did not answer immediately. The pause was its own answer. I told him I needed some time to think. I went upstairs. I sat in the bedroom we had shared for 18 years, and I thought about the 2 hours I had just spent listening to my husband describe a reality that had been operating parallel to our marriage for 4 years. I thought about the Wednesday evening and the kitchen table, and the practice matter-of-factness and the 3 words. Nothing to worry about. I thought about the woman I had been before that document. Patient, trusting, operating on the assumption that the person who shared my life was sharing it fully. I thought about the woman I was going to need to be going forward, and I understood that those 2 women were not going to be the same woman. The weeks that followed were the most complex of my adult life. Patricia guided me through a process of financial discovery, the formal legal term for what happens when you need to understand the complete financial picture before making decisions about a marriage. What emerged from that process was more detailed than what Richard had told me in our 2-hour conversation, not because he had lied in that conversation, but because there were elements of the situation that he himself had not fully mapped. The commercial debt was substantial. The personal guarantee I had nearly signed would have exposed my assets, including my business and my share of our home, to significant risk. Patricia was measured in how she described this, but she was not ambiguous. She said I had been within a signature of a very difficult situation. She said that 3 days was not a long time, but that in this case it had been exactly long enough. Richard retained his own attorney. This was, Patricia told me, the correct and expected development. It did not mean divorce was inevitable. It meant that we were both now operating with legal counsel in a situation that had legal dimensions, which was simply the appropriate framework for what we were navigating. There were conversations, many of them, with attorneys, with each other, eventually with a couples therapist that I insisted on and that Richard agreed to, with the compliance of someone who understood that resistance was not a position available to him at that moment. The therapist was useful in ways I had not expected, not in saving the marriage. I was not certain it could be saved, and I was not certain I wanted it to be, but in helping me understand what had happened with enough clarity to make a real decision rather than a reactive one. What I learned about Richard in that process was both more sympathetic and more damning than I had expected. More sympathetic because his concealment had been driven by shame and fear in ways that were genuinely human. He had been drowning professionally, and he had been too proud and too frightened to tell me, and the concealment had compounded itself the way secrets do, each layer of it making the eventual disclosure more difficult until disclosure had begun to feel impossible. I understood this. I did not excuse it, but I understood it. More damning because the document had not been an accident or an oversight. He had known exactly what it contained. He had made a decision to present it to me as simple and to apply deadline pressure and to rely on my trust and my tendency to defer to him on his professional matters. He had made a calculation about me, about my likeliness to read carefully, to push back, to ask questions. The calculation had been wrong, but the calculation had been made. That is the part I have found hardest to move past. Not the debt, not the concealment, not the professional failure. The calculation, the specific decision to rely on my trust as a mechanism. I filed for divorce 8 months after the document appeared on the kitchen table. I had not made that decision quickly. I had made it carefully and with full information, and with the advice of Patricia and the input of the therapist and the counsel of my own extended reflection. I had considered the version of the marriage that could exist on the other side of this disclosure, the version where we rebuilt transparency and renegotiated the terms of our partnership on an honest foundation. I had given that version genuine consideration. I had concluded that I could not build something new with a person whose response to crisis had been to hand me a document and tell me it was nothing to worry about. The divorce proceedings took 14 months. They were, by the standards of contested divorces, relatively organized, partly because Patricia was excellent, and partly because Richard's attorney was realistic, and partly because both of us, whatever had broken between us, did not want to damage our children with a protracted war. We had that in common at the end. We protected our children with a consistency that I am genuinely grateful for. The financial settlement addressed the commercial debt in ways that took the full 14 months to structure. My assets, my business, my professional income were protected. Our home was sold, the proceeds divided according to the agreement our attorneys reached. It was not the outcome I had imagined for the house we had bought together in our 3rd year of marriage. It was the outcome that was fair given the reality of what our marriage had actually been during the years I had not fully known. There is one specific moment from the proceedings that I want to tell you about, because I think it is the moment the title of this story points toward. About 4 months into the formal divorce process, there was a meeting, a full financial disclosure session with both parties and both attorneys present, during which Richard's complete professional financial picture was laid out in documented detail. I had known the broad contours of it by then, but this session was the formal legal presentation, organized and itemized and official in the way that formal legal presentations are. Richard's attorney had prepared the presentation. She was professional and competent, and had clearly done the work carefully. But when certain figures were laid out alongside the timeline of when Richard had known specific things, when the chronology of the concealment was made visible as a chronology, something happened in the room. Richard's attorney paused at one point in her own presentation. A brief pause, a reorientation, the kind that happens when you are presenting material, and you see it from the receiving side for a moment, and it lands differently than it did in preparation. She continued professionally, but the pause had been real, and I had been watching. Afterward, Patricia said to me in the corridor that the timeline had been clarifying for everyone in the room. I said I thought so too. She said that Richard's attorney was a competent professional, and that what her expression had communicated was not a reflection on her legal work, but on the material she had been given to present. I nodded. I understood what she was saying without her saying it directly. The material had told a story that was difficult to present with a straight face, not because anyone had done anything technically illegal, or at least nothing that the proceedings were structured to address in those terms, but because the story of a man who had watched his professional life deteriorate for 4 years while carefully managing what his wife knew, who had finally arrived at a kitchen table with 11 pages and told her it was simple, was a story with a shape that spoke for itself. His attorney knew it. Richard knew it. The room knew it. I am not going to tell you that I felt triumphant. I want to be honest about what I actually felt, which was sad in the particular way of watching something you built over 20 years be examined in a conference room under fluorescent lighting and found to have been less solid than it appeared. That is not triumph. That is grief wearing a different face. What I felt alongside the grief was something else. A steadiness, a knowledge that I had read the document, that I had not signed it, that I had made the call on a Thursday morning and taken the appointment and walked into Patricia's office with 11 pages and allowed someone who understood these things to tell me what I was actually holding. That steadiness has not left me. It is different from confidence, which I have always had in professional contexts. It is something more fundamental. It is the knowledge that I am capable of protecting myself when protection is required, that the instinct that made me not sign, that small, cold stillness on a Wednesday evening in November, was real and trustworthy and mine. I live in an apartment now. It is smaller than the house, and it is entirely mine, which I find daily satisfying in a way I would not have predicted. My business is intact. My professional relationships are intact. My children are navigating the divorce with the resilience of young people who have been given the truth at an appropriate level, and who know that both their parents love them without condition. Richard is navigating his professional situation. I am told, through the channels that remain open when children are shared, that things are improving for him slowly. I do not follow it closely. I wish him, in the neutral way that you wish someone well when you are finished with them, a manageable future. What I think about when I think about the document is the space between the kitchen table and Patricia's office. 3 days, 11 pages, 1 phone call, 1 appointment that I almost did not make because some part of me kept saying that surely this was what he said it was, that 20 years of marriage was evidence of trustworthiness, that the instinct I was feeling was anxiety rather than information. It was information. It was the most important information I received that year, and it was delivered not by a lawyer or a financial analyst or any external source, but by something inside me that had been paying attention to the small things for long enough to recognize that the practice matter-of-factness and the standing by the counter and the 3 words were not nothing. They were everything. I want to say something to you if you are a person who has ever been handed something and told it was simple. If you have ever been asked to sign something with deadline pressure and reassurance in the same breath. If you have ever felt that small, cold stillness and then talked yourself out of it because the relationship seemed like evidence against your own instinct. Read the document, every page, every clause. Look up the words you do not know. Call the person your friend mentioned 3 years ago and use the name and take the appointment even if you feel like you are overreacting. You are probably not overreacting. In 20 years of marriage, I signed many things. Mortgages, joint tax returns, the documents that accompany a life built in partnership. I signed them having read them, but I signed them without the particular quality of attention that the Wednesday evening in November demanded. That evening required something different. Something shifted in me and named itself, without words, as a moment requiring care. I listened. I did not sign. I made a phone call. 3 days later, I sat across from a woman named Patricia, who told me what I had almost signed. 3 days. It is not a long time. It was exactly long enough. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Read everything before you sign it. Trust the instinct that tells you to wait. Make the call. More stories are coming. I will see you in the next one.